symposium that I believe everyone was wanting information for. So this is that information, and there you have it. It's there, trust me. And then, so we're going to talk about photo ID today. We had a bill last year, 334, went through the process and ended up like most bills here, dead in the Senate. Not because there was a lack of interest, it's just things don't always happen in the Senate. It didn't happen last year on House Bill 334. We have a couple people that want to testify. I'm going to let Representative Simmons, if it's okay with you, we have a lady who would like to testify that I think she missed 4 flights last time when she came to testify. She was very patient last time, and they have a couple other meetings throughout the building. With your approval, sir, because I know you're going to talk about 334, if we'd let Madeline go first, she's going to give a pretty general thing, I think, on photo ID. If you're okay with that, that's what we're going to do. We have a hard stop at noon, so rather than me pontificate too much, Madeline, please, I know you filled out your witness protection form and all that stuff, so please proceed when ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Schall and Vice Chairwoman McGaugh and honorable members of the committee, my name is Madeline Melissa, and I am a policy fellow at the Foundation for Government Accountability. I was here last month, as you mentioned, to testify, having missed 4 flights, and I testified on election and initiative reforms before your committee, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify again today about the importance of voter ID. I've been in many states to discuss this issue, and I commend your committee for putting aside the rhetoric of the moment and for digging into the details of how to restore both voter confidence and increase ballot security here in Missouri. One way to do that is to require a government-issued photo ID for in-person voting and to implement a corresponding identification requirement for absentee voters. Currently, as you are aware, Missouri law only requires voters to present non-photo identification while voting in person. Requiring voters to show a government-issued ID will simultaneously confirm the voter's identity and also preclude a bad actor from stealing their vote. Proving that you are who you say you are with photo ID is just common sense. It also makes perfect sense to voters. In fact, polling demonstrates that 73% of all voters support this reform. Across the country, 36 states have already passed laws requiring or requesting identification at the polls, and a majority of those require photo ID. Your neighbors, Kansas and Arkansas, have both implemented strong photo ID laws. In order to secure absentee voting and provide consistency with in-person voting, Missouri should also consider that voters include their driver's license number or the last 4 digits of their Social Security number on their ballot envelope. This reform will significantly strengthen the absentee voting process and provide critical information if an issue does arise. A majority of voters also support this requirement for absentee voting. Arkansas, Ohio, Wisconsin, and other states all use this very simple process to verify absentee or mail ballots. Missouri voters are passionate about the fundamental right that we all have as Americans to vote. They don't want weaknesses in the design of the elections to threaten that right, and they don't want a fraudulent vote to cancel out their vote. These common sense identification reforms that many other states have enacted are worth your consideration as you move forward in your review of elections here in the state of Missouri. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to testify first here today, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Any questions for the witness? Representative Tolson Rush, please proceed.
I just was wondering if you knew off the top of your head how many states do have photo ID, and if you're not sure, maybe the Secretary of State's might know that. Just curious.
So as I mentioned, there are 36 states that
36.
require some sort of identification.
Okay, I missed that. Thank you.
A majority of those are photo identification, yes.
Any other questions? Representative Wyndham, welcome to the committee today, sir. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Nice to see you again.
So remind me what the name of your organization is again?
It's the Foundation for Government Accountability.
Okay. And where's your organization headquartered at?
It is located in Naples, but we work across the country. I live in Portland, Maine.
Okay. And does the founder of your organization, what's his deal? Can you give me a little bit of his biography?
Sure. The founder of our organization is Taryn Bragdon. He was a legislator in the state of Maine before he founded the Foundation for Government Accountability, as I mentioned, in Naples.
Okay. And when he was a state representative, what party did he run under?
He was a Republican.
Okay. And the Foundation for Government Accountability, how many states do they advocate in?
I'm sorry.
How many states does your organization advocate in?
In terms of staff or the where we work? Well, we work across the country in 35 states.
Okay. And do y'all have any staff in Missouri?
Yes, we do. Okay. My colleague here today, Greg, is with us, and he lives in the state of Missouri.
What's Greg's last name?
Want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Greg Pfister. I live in Greene County.
All right, thank you for that. So, does Maine have photo voter ID?
We do not.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative McGaugh, proceed. Proceed.
Thank you. Welcome. And I know it was hard to leave Maine, the beautiful state, in this day. My question quickly, could you please describe what you have to me previously, how the Social Security and other pertinent information is hidden from view on the absentee envelopes?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So in terms of keeping the secrecy of the ballot, that goes inside, and then the identification goes on an interior flap such that it doesn't compromise the secrecy of the ballot. There's a spot for the voter to fill it out.
Further questions? Representative Simmons, proceed.
To inquire, Chairman, thank you. So in the scenario with those ballots, do you know how many states have that type of setup?
You mean in terms of the absentee ballots?
Yeah.
Well, the states that come to mind, Ohio and Wisconsin are good examples if you want to take a look at the actual physical makeup of the ballot.
That incorporate either the last four digits or
the Social Security number.
Or the
Yep.
license number. And I think your organization, do you do surveys or polls of the pulse of the people in these states in terms of their wishes and what they like to see as far as integrity at the ballot? Do you have any research on that? We
most certainly do. And as I mentioned in my testimony here today, the majority of Americans support voter ID, 73% across both parties.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Anyone else from the committee? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Quick question. Are the leaves changing in Maine yet?
They are. We've had some cold nights.
Representative Berenger, I think that'd be a wonderful suggestion that sometime we go out a la carte and try some Maine lobster. But according to law in Missouri, I think we'd have to be very careful how we would taste that ourselves. So. Thank you very much. Representative Simmons, would you like to give us an overbrief or what you'd like to say about House Bill 334 that you carried last year?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, the committee's obviously, aware of this. It was really the second incarnation of statutory language that was basically reflecting what the constitutional amendment that was put into our Constitution in 2016 by the overwhelming support of Missouri voters. And it was actually in kind of direct response based on a court case that the Supreme Court decided on back in, I guess that probably would have been 2019, no, early 2020 possibly. And so they struck down a couple of provisions that the General Assembly had put together in their statutory language connected to that ballot. And so what House Bill 334, the main thrust of it was giving two options for people to vote. One, as the testimony talked about, is issuing a government photo ID, and if that wasn't available for whatever reason, that they had a provisional ballot that could be legally cast, and that was equal in weight to that. The third option, which is what the court had struck down in their decision, was going through some kind of affidavit statement reasoning, saying that you didn't have an ID, but you could still show a utility bill or some kind of tax statement or something with your name on it, but no photo ID. And when they created that decision, it was kind of a technical decision based on that affidavit language, not the concept of having some kind of affidavit written, because I know some states do actually have an affidavit. Ours was kind of confusing, and if you're frank about that language, I think it was, and looking at it. So we tried to simplify what people would do. People want a photo ID, so that was the primary focus. And then if that wasn't available, they could still cast a ballot with that provisional, and the local election authority would still be able to check and do their due diligence, like to do with any ballot measure or any ballot that comes through, to make sure that was indeed a legal ballot cast and is accepted like all the other ones. And that was the main thrust of the bill. It included, voting absentee, an absentee ballot, as well as in person on election day. And that's just kind of the overview of that, Mr. Chairman. I can continue after that as you wish.
I think you did a pretty good job. I imagine we'll see a bill very similar again next year, won't we? Or this coming session?
It'll be a Groundhog Day again in the General Assembly.
Well, it won't be it'll be, let's say it's Groundhog Day in the House.
Yeah, that's a very true
statement. Don't say the General Assembly. In simple terms, this is taking what the Supreme Court said was wrong, fixing it, still preserving the intent of what the legislature originally passed, right?
Yeah, and no one's turned away. The beauty of this bill and the 1600 bill that was the year before was that no one has turned away at the precinct. Even if you're at the wrong precinct, you can still cast that provisional ballot. And once they do the due diligence that you are allowed to vote, you're a legal voter to vote, and you meet all the other criteria, then that ballot is deemed proper like any other ballot. So the beauty of it is everyone is not disenfranchised or actually enfranchised. And it's really protecting the people that don't want their vote canceled out by someone who is creating some nefarious situations at the ballot. And Missouri has history of that, either through the absentee ballot or ballot harvesting, and things of that nature. So there's a lot of examples, and even just one vote makes a big difference in elections, as we've seen with a sitting senator over in the Missouri Senate.
Very good, very good. From the committee, is there anything that you want to inquire of Representative Simmons? I think we've all sat through this and kind of understand where we're at. Does anybody have any questions for him? Thank you, Representative Simmons. You do not need to fill out a witness protection form. How many people do we have that's going to testify on photo ID today? All right, I think we can get this done. We do have a hard stop at 5 minutes to 12 by the clock in the back because it's actually slow. With that, whoever would like to come up and testify, Secretary Ashcroft? Secretary, if you'll wait a minute, sure. Representative Wyndham, what would you like to say?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to point out to the committee that we don't have a bill on the hearing list today. It's just generally photo voter ID, not necessarily HB 334 from last year.
You are absolutely correct,
Mr.
but for proper context, I think it was very good that Representative Simmons was able to describe House Bill 334 to make sure that we knew what we were referring to last year. And certainly, if you'd like to file one this year, I'd certainly be willing to hear that bill in our committee. Representative Wyndham. Secretary, now, please proceed.
Hello, my name, as you know, is Secretary Jay Ashcroft. Very thankful for the opportunity to come here. Thank you, Chairman, Vice Chairwoman, Ranking Member, and everyone else. I support a photo ID requirement in state law that makes sure that we know who is voting without turning away any registered voter. As you all know, in 2016, the people of the state voted on an amendment, a constitutional amendment. 63% of the voters said that they wanted to allow the state to require a photo ID for the purposes of identification, citizenship, and residency. There was a photo ID bill that was passed. The Missouri Supreme Court in January of 2020 struck down a portion of that so that the people of the state would no longer either have to show that government-issued photo ID or other ID along with an accompanying statement, or use that provisional ballot where their signature could be checked by the election authority after the election. I think this is a great opportunity not only to secure our elections, but also to make it simpler. You show up with your government-issued photo ID, which the state will happily provide for free to you, which we do. We've gone so far as taking IDs to people, frankly, that were in the hospital, and we expected them to never leave the hospital, but they still had the right to vote, and we wanted to make sure they had that ID for them. Additionally, our photo ID law, although we've been sued many times over it, and we have had people say that individuals would be disenfranchised, they have never been able to point to a single person that would be or was disenfranchised by it. And to the contrary, we have been able to point in every major election to individuals that would have been turned away under the old law, but were allowed to vote because of the photo ID law. A photo ID law that increases the security of our elections, helps people to have more faith in our elections, and also increases voter participation is frankly something we all ought to be able to agree with, and it's unfortunate that some cannot. Happy to take any questions or go sit down and shut up if you'd prefer.
Any questions for the Secretary? Representative McGaugh, proceed.
To inquire. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Good to see you again. So I believe I've asked this question before, and I think probably someone in the audience can help you with the number if you don't know it off the top of your head, and that is, since you implemented the Show It to Vote, how many people have you helped with getting a photo ID?
We've helped roughly 1,000 people a year. I think there was one year where we were as high as 1,400. There have been other years where it's been closer to 800. I don't exactly know where we are this year in that. We have the financial resources, we have the wherewithal to help more people, but we're not having people that want assistance with that. In fact, I've been in meetings like this before you where people have testified that they had a mother that couldn't get an ID, and then the same person that testified refused to give our office the information to help that mother get an ID. Anyone that wants an ID can get one. It will be done for free. They do not need to pay for the underlying documents. We have the resources, and we're happy to provide it.
Well, thank you for that. Also, then quickly, can you just walk through, if the person is, say, in a hospital in a small rural county, how do you help them? Does the local DMV help them? Does the local county clerk? How do those people get in touch?
It is a partnership with the Department of Motor Vehicles, Department of Revenue, because they provide the photo IDs, and it's fact specific. There have been times where I actually went to an individual's house. They were a quadriplegic, so I went there to have them fill out the information. We had it notarized there. Then we took that information down to Vital. I think we needed a Vital record from Vital Records, so we got that, and then we took it back to them. It just varies depending upon the circumstances. But with the individual over on the western side of the state in the hospital, had to visit them, get some information, get them the ID, and then take it back to present them to them. We're happy to do that. It's the right thing to do.
So it sounds like, you go above and beyond helping a person, and that's very commendable. But it's not something you can turn around really quickly in front of a big election, right? I mean, if you have to do the work through the archives, they would need to start early is what I'm getting at.
Well, people are required to be registered, 4 weeks before an election to vote. And what is commonly, when people talk about this law, they commonly talk about the voter ID part, which is important. But they seem to forget that even if you don't have that photo ID, that government-issued photo ID, you're allowed to vote that provisional ballot. And then that provisional ballot, by law, must be counted if you meet the other requirements for voting. And they verify who you are by matching your signature on that ballot with the signature they have on file. And frankly, you know better, I think, than everybody else on the committee how much local election authorities work to find whether or not that signature matches. We've had election authorities go back several elections to see if a signature was changing over time, because at first glance the signature didn't match. But when I said, well, wait a minute, it does, because that's been changing that way for the last 10 years. So we're trying to make the law more secure, but also make sure that everybody can vote that's legally registered. It's that simple.
Thank you. Thank you for your help. Thank you, Chair.
Representative Wyndham, proceed, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to you.
Good morning, gentlemen.
So right now, does a student ID from a university, does that count as photo ID or as a ID to count to vote?
Under the law, a student ID would generally count under what was option number 2. Technically, I'd have to see the ID, what information was on it, and how it was actually, was it a state school, was it not, where was it from? But generally speaking, a student ID will work.
Sure, it has to be from a state institution. And what are the other requirements for a student ID to be able to work as a voter ID?
The HB 1638, I think it was, has all the actual requirements for what's required under step number 2, the ones that would require a statement with them that also included like a cable bill, utility bill, that sort of thing. I don't have that right in front of me, but you should have it right there on your iPad.
I don't.
You can pull it up.
I could, but I'm asking you.
I understand. I was just telling you where to get the information because you didn't have it and I don't have it, so I wanted to be helpful.
Sure. Well, I can't pull it up at the same time that I'm talking to you, so I was asking you the question. Okay, so what's the process for, so you don't know right offhand what other information needs to be on the student ID? For them
I don't have the law in front of me.
Okay. Okay. So under HB 334 of last year, would a student ID be counted as a valid ID?
Under HB 334, it would have required a government-issued photo ID, or you would have had to do the provisional ballot. So without having the student ID in front of me, but my thought process is that would not be a government-issued ID, although we do have some schools that are on military bases here in Missouri where that might count. I'd have to look at it. It's fact-specific. But they would, if nothing else, be able to use their signature in the provisional ballot, or they could just ask us and we'd get them a government-issued photo ID so they could vote, which would be the easiest and would also help them to do everything else in society and in life that you need a government-issued ID to do.
Well, I'm asking about the student ID. I'm not asking about going to your office.
Well, I understand, but this is about government-issued photo IDs and making sure people can vote.
But this is my line of question, Mr. Secretary. So I'm asking you about student IDs, not about your office helping them get an ID far in advance.
Well, I thought you would care if we would help people get IDs to help them vote.
We're talking about this specific subject at which I'm asking the questions here. So what's the process of checking signatures?
Local election authorities, if you do a provisional ballot, technically you can come back in with your government-issued photo ID to have them to prove that you are who you say you are. most people, I'm assuming, it's an assumption, so it could be wrong, but I'm assuming most people don't have time to go back into the vote polling place a second time with their ID. So what happens is, and it's slightly different by every election authority, but generally speaking, once the polls close, I don't know of any that check those while the polls are going on because they're usually busy. They go ahead and take those provisional ballots that were in a sealed container, and then they actually check that signature on the ballot envelope. They're not looking at the ballot, they're looking at the ballot envelope, and they compare that to the individual's registration because there's a signature required as part of registration.
Okay, so it's done by a site, not necessarily by a computer program or software.
Yes, I know of no computer software that I would feel confident about that.
Okay. So
we've met with vendors, but their software just hasn't been very good.
Okay, and is that your subjective opinion, or is that across the board that they haven't been trustworthy? From what I understand.
Well, I didn't say anything about being trustworthy, sir.
What was the word you just used?
I did not think that the
good.
software was good at making a comparison of signatures. That has nothing to do with whether or not they were trustworthy, sir.
Okay. Well, the thing that I was trying to get at was, at first you said we, now you're saying I. So that was my main question: was it the clerks across the board that said that, or was it just your opinion that said that?
Well, I said that I had met with them. I can't speak for whether election authorities have met with them and whether or not they feel that the software does a good job. But I'm sure that they would be happy to testify that to whether or not they did if they were asked.
Okay. So at what point are provisional ballots counted?
As soon as the signature is checked, if the signature verifies that individual, then it's counted. It's right away. I mean, it's
at the same time as all the other ballots.
No. In some places, absentee ballots are not counted until later. So we could have provisional ballots that are counted before some of the absentee ballots that come in late are.
Okay. And so you spoke about 1,000 IDs per year, and what's the process for someone to come to your office and get a photo ID?
Well, I mean, the easiest way is for them not to come to our office. I mean, they can just give us a call. They can reach out to us on our website. They can send us a message through there. They can email us. Obviously, they can come to our office if they want to, but it seems like it'd be a lot more difficult if we made them come to our office, so we don't do that, Representative.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for the Secretary? I got one. This government-issued ID that you're going to provide free.
We help. Technically, Department of Revenue does it.
Right. But this ID, is it only used for elections?
What they get is a non-driver's license.
So it could be used for other things.
Yes.
And let's see, I guess when we went to the bank, if we needed to, we could use that for check cashing.
Voting in union elections, going into government buildings, things like that, yes.
Maybe getting a vaccine. I think you have to show ID to get vaccines now. So actually, you're doing more for the good of the people to give them the ID they need to do things other than just vote. And you're doing it free of charge.
We hope it helps people.
Yeah. All right. Representative Simmons, please.
I've got some specific numbers from the Department of Revenue about the success of the program that the General Assembly, was good in creating that statute to allow for the Secretary of State and all the government agencies and the Department of Revenue to be successful in getting these people those non-drivers photo IDs that you're talking about, Mr. Chairman. 2017, 331 were issued and 9 were rejected. 1678 in 2018, 18 were rejected. 2019, 1,409 were approved. 1 was rejected that year. And then 2020, a big election year, 985 were approved. 1,442 were rejected. So that the protection and making sure the reason they're rejected, if they already have some actually applicable, allowable ID, they're not needing this, they'll be able to vote with once they do their investigation or they're checking with the people that are curious about getting that. So yeah, to live in our society, we need a photo ID, and I've got a long list, more than what you and the secretary were sharing. So to be engaged and to receive welfare benefits and to do anything with travel requires a photo ID. So I applaud the Secretary of State and the General Assembly who put that provision in to help these people live a more engaged life, as well as allow them to vote and have it be a protected vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions? Representative Behringer. Proceed.
To inquire.
Proceed.
Thank you. I have a question because I know provisional ballots, I know you said that they're, as long as they meet those other requirements, that they get counted.
There are two different types of provisional ballots, lady.
Okay.
So I don't want to mislead you on that. There are provisional ballots for lack of identification, which I was speaking about. There are provisional ballots that are required under federal law when people do not show up as being registered to vote at the precinct or registered to vote. So there are two different types of provisional ballots. I was talking about the no identity ones. If that was misleading, and I should have been talking about the other ones, I'm happy to do that. But I just want to make sure I didn't mislead you there.
Okay. But on both counts, and I'm glad you defined that for me, because I want to know how many statewide provisional votes are not counted in both areas.
With regard to people that are not registered to vote, the vast majority, a large quantity of those are not counted, because if you're not registered to vote, you're not legally allowed to vote. With regard to the lack of identification provisional ballots, we are in the high 90% of those that are counted.
90%.
But yes, it's above 90. It's up near the upper end. But I can't say 99. But it's high.
And can you give me a number? Because 90% of 10 votes versus
I can get you those numbers. We provide those numbers to the Election Assistance Commission. That's the U.S. commission that helps with election security, certifies election equipment. We report those after every major election, so we can't get those for you.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions for the Secretary? Mr. Secretary, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else to which, anyone else like to speak on photo ID? Please proceed. And I see you got your witness form there. Fantastic. Thank you. Just leave it up there. She'll get it when we're done. Proceed when ready, lady. Would you push a little green, the button there so it goes green down there at the bottom? There's a little. Okay, I thought so. Fantastic. With
Oh, now it's brighter. Okay.
there we go.
Sorry about that.
So you said your husband shares the name with a couple other gentlemen in
In
town,
the same town, yes.
and that becomes troublesome, I'm sure,
Big time.
because if the other two aren't paying attention, they're the correct Larry Berry,
Right.
and I could see where that could be, and then it could even be problematic if, but one voted absentee and the other two didn't.
Right. So it's very important that we have the right photo ID so there's no conflict.
But I guess the people that would argue against this would say, well, you can, without photo ID, I can show you a utility bill, but if Larry Berry's getting the wrong Larry Berry's utility bill, I guess it makes it even worse. So
Yes.
I guess might as well use the photo ID that Secretary Ashcroft's going to provide free. So any questions for this lady? Representative Wyndham, please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning to you. Okay. So what does your husband use to vote?
Pardon?
What does your husband use to vote? What form of identification does your husband use?
He's registered, and he has his, they, from our address, they send us a registration, and we go where, I'm from Warsaw, Missouri, so we go where we're told to go, and we vote.
I just meant, like, does he use his photo
His
ID
card.
or he uses his voter registration card that doesn't
Yes,
have a photo
yes,
on it?
Yes.
Does it have?
And he also uses his driver's license. He brings them both.
Okay, so even if he uses his voter registration card, does it have y'all's address on it?
I believe it does, yes.
Is there any other people that live in the same house with his name?
No.
Okay. Because I kind of have the same situation, even though I have a very unique name being Wyndham, Kevin Wyndham. My father actually has the same name. We don't use senior and junior, and we haven't run into that issue. So I'm
All the
just
more
wondering.
that you need photo ID.
Well, no, it's not all the more that I need photo ID because it's never been a problem, and we have the exact same name, just different birthdays, and that's something that we have in our system. So I'm just still trying to see if that's actually an issue or if that's just something that may kind of just be a non-issue. Still something to talk about, but not an issue. So.
Oh, my husband can talk to you about it because he gets aggravated when they get him confused with somebody else, especially when it comes to his credit.
Sure. All right. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else? Representative Adams, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to inquire. You made a statement that you need an ID to do all kinds of activity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, and I do know Warsaw because I had property down there many centuries ago. There are people who are, quote, non-banking. They do not bank. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't bank, you don't need a photo ID.
I've never run across anybody who didn't bank. So.
Well, I have. I'm
yeah.
saying that. And as you were saying, even with a photo ID, it doesn't help. We just remembered 9/11. And at that time, in 2001 and past, I used to travel a lot. And I had to go to the airport, and they were generating all kinds of new travel restrictions. And like your husband, I have a very common name. And I was always getting stopped for a number of years when I went to the airport because of my name. There was, I don't know if he's still alive, but I'm assuming he still is, a gentleman in St. Louis County who has my name. And even though I had a photographic ID to get to the airport, I'm African American, and he is a Caucasian. This gentleman was what is called, by profession, a soldier of fortune. And I was always getting identified as him. So I'm going to tell you, photo IDs don't always do it either for you.
You think it would?
I think it would, yeah.
Tell between the difference between the two.
Well, I guess not. Maybe not. But that photo ID, my driver's license, and my other ID, because I was a municipal official, had that ID, it didn't work. So I'm going to tell you, photo IDs don't always matter. There's other things too. But there are people who do not bank, who don't travel, or anything else. though they are registered to vote.
Do they not go to hotels or buy liquor
No.
or cigarettes or anything like
Probably
that?
not.
And they don't need an ID especially if they're younger age?
If they're young age, but if you're somebody like Representative Simmons' age, they're going to check his ID if he goes by a six-pack of beer. I don't think so. I bet he couldn't even tell you the last time somebody checked his ID at a liquor store. Yeah. So, hey. So be careful by saying everybody has to have one. Not everybody has to have one.
Well, I'd like to see everybody have one just for ID.
Which I think is interesting, because I guess if we were having another hearing somewhere else in this building or somewhere else, there would be some people saying they didn't want the government to be able to check where they were and where they're going and everything else. So, I mean, it's 6-1 and half a dozen.
No.
So thank you very much, though. I was just trying to figure out, because there are people who do not bank. Because I used to be on a bank board of directors, and the bank president was always upset with people going to check cashing places and everything else instead of getting a bank account, which would treat them a heck of a lot better than those check cashing places that basically rip them off. So you talk to the Bankers Association and see how they feel about photo ID. They probably agree with you, but they'll tell you there are people who do not have it. So thank you very much, though, for your input.
Okay.
Thank you. Representative Adams, if I may have asked you a question, when you went and you kept being identified as the soldier of fortune, if you didn't have your ID to show that you were not the Caucasian soldier of fortune, you would have probably been detained a little longer before they realized you were a good serviceman of the United States Air Force retiree that doesn't commit those type of things, right? So I was thankful you had a photo ID. That's all I had to say. Any other questions for the lady? Thank you very much for your time today. And you left the witness form up there, right? Fantastic, fantastic. Anyone else testify on photo ID? Lady, we had written testimony you submitted. Is this going to be in place of that or in addition to?
Thank you, Chairman Shaw. This will be in addition to the written testimony that I've already submitted.
Fantastic. Committee, this has been distributed to you, her other additional testimony. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Shaw, members of the committee. My name is Denise Lieberman. I am the Director and General Counsel of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, which is Missouri's statewide network, a nonpartisan network of voter advocates who work to protect the right to vote. We do this through policy advocacy, legal advocacy, litigation, voter education and engagement, and by running the state's nonpartisan election protection program. Our coalition includes approximately 60 affiliated organizations statewide. We've been 15 years, and we're here again.
Welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back. I am a voting rights attorney. I've been working in this field for over 20 years, in addition to serving as the director of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. I previously served as the national director of the Voting Rights Program at Advancement Project National Office. I'm also currently a consultant with the Brennan Center for Justice out of New York. And I'm also an adjunct professor of political science and law at Washington University in St. Louis, where I teach courses that include voting rights and election law. I have been deeply involved in voter ID and photo ID controversies across the country, having personally been involved in litigation in a half dozen states, including 4 photo ID lawsuits here in Missouri, and am widely considered an expert on voter identification laws. So I'm honored to be able to speak to you today. As an outset, I'm gratified to see that this committee is taking seriously the importance of having discussions about the state of voting rights and access to the ballot for Missouri's voters. And you're doing so well ahead of the start of the legislative session and setting aside a great deal of time for these conversations, and I appreciate that. However, as an initial matter, I have to say that the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition does object to the process and form of this hearing, having a public hearing where there's no legislation actually before the body. We know, and you know, having dealt with photo ID requirements over the last 15 years, that the devil's in the details. The question of whether a voter identification requirement is going to be legal or not, whether it's going to disenfranchise voters or not, is based on the specifics and the particulars of the legislation before it. 35 states across the country have some form of voter identification requirement, but they differ across the board. And just to clarify the prior witness's statement, only about 7 states actually require a strict photo ID mandate to vote. In short, not having any specific piece of legislation prevents experts like myself from opining about how a court might review such legislation. It prevents people with data from being able to apply social science data to an analysis of legislation, and it prevents voters themselves from being able to speak to this committee about the potential impacts that any such legislation would have on them or their ability to cast a ballot. Accordingly, we strongly believe that any testimony being heard here today is informational only and should therefore have no binding impact on any future legislation considered by this committee, nor should it be considered adequate public comment on any future legislative proposals. And rest assured, we will be back in January when these bills come back up, but those bills deserve, and the citizens of Missouri are entitled to, a full public hearing on the actual implications of those pieces of legislation. Now, that said, as this committee is...
Can I clarify something? So what you just said was that everything we're hearing today, we should discard and pay no attention to the testimony of the people today.
That is not what I said, Chairman Shaw. I said that the testimony offered here today should be considered for informational purposes only and have no binding effect on future legislation. In short, our point is...
I must have heard it wrong because layman's terms, I'm not a lawyer and I've never pretended to be one, nor will I ever be one. It seemed to me that you were discounting the testimony today that was not as adequate as testimony during session. The reason we do not have a bill today because there are no bills filed. And rather than wait until January to try to squeeze everybody's comments on this general area and to allow our committee members who are going to draft bills and pre-file them in December and file them throughout the session, we felt it was imperative to make sure that we understood the feelings of the people. So I believe the committee will take what they hear today for informational purposes only to create a bill that we will go through the due process of hearings and everything. So don't think that we are going to short circuit the process in any means. We've never done that in the committee, and to insinuate that we might, I find insulting. I will not short circuit the process. This committee has been very nonpartisan in all the issues brought before it, and I look forward to hearing the further of your testimony. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all we ask, is that this not be considered a substitute for future public testimony on pending legislation. But that said, as the committee is considering photo ID, as you have done over every year for the last 15 years in this state, several important points. First off, this is not a discussion about whether people should have identification. This is not a discussion about whether people should have to present identification to vote. Missouri already requires all voters to show identification. Like I said, 35 states require voters to present identification at the polls, including Missouri. The question that we're talking about here today, and the question that has been presented in each of the previous year's legislation that's been introduced, is whether this state can properly restrict and limit the forms of identification voters may show to only that which may be acquired at the Department of Motor Vehicles or through the federal government and be non-expired. Here's what we know. Even without having a piece of legislation before us, one thing is unequivocally clear, and that is that a strict photo ID requirement to vote, in other words, that is defined as a non-expired identification with a photo that is issued only by the particular state, the state of Missouri, or the federal government, is patently unconstitutional in the state of Missouri. This has been affirmed not just once, but twice by the Missouri Supreme Court as recently as January of 2020 in the priorities case. Obviously, the first case came out of the first effort of this committee to pass strict photo ID requirements in Missouri in 2006. It went to the Missouri Supreme Court in a case called Weinshank versus Missouri, where they found that was unconstitutional because of the burdens that limiting and restricting the forms of ID to vote would present to voters. In 2020, when the priorities case came before the Missouri Supreme Court, they actually considered an option just like which was presented before this committee last year in House Bill 334. The Secretary of State asked the court to consider eliminating all Option 2 IDs, all non-photo IDs. And the Missouri Supreme Court said that would not be permissible because it would violate Weinshank and present constitutional problems. This has been litigated time and time and time again. We know that any effort to enshrine a strict photo ID requirement that so severely limits the forms of identification to that which over 200,000 valid Missouri voters lack and would have difficulty obtaining even with the Secretary of State's Show It to Vote program is patently unconstitutional. We will file a lawsuit. It will be struck down. And so I suggest that it is folly for this committee to yet again consider legislation that it knows to be unconstitutional, that it knows to be struck down. Lawmakers took an oath to defend and protect the Constitution of this state. We should not be promulgating legislation that we know clearly and fully to be unconstitutional. A couple of quick other points before I sit down. I want to speak to the Secretary of State's Show It to Vote program and the discussion of that, well, anybody who needs an ID can get one. First off, that's not necessarily true. We've had multiple trials where we presented witness after witness after witness after witness who's not able to get those forms of ID, perhaps because they're unable to get the underlying documents necessary to get a state ID. Perhaps those underlying documents exist in another state. If you were born in another state, if you were married or divorced in another state, if you changed your name in another state, you're going to have to get those documents from those states. And if any of those documents either don't exist because they were destroyed in natural disasters, I've had clients that's happened to, or because there's errors on those underlying documents. The spelling of the name was the situation in one of my lead plaintiffs in the North Carolina photo ID litigation. So these will all prevent you from getting a DMV-issued ID. Again, the issue here is not whether people should have identification. I have litigated a dozen photo ID lawsuits and had dozens of clients. Every one of them had identification. What they lacked or could not get was the limited form of ID that a restrictive strict photo ID requirement presented. And that is what the issue is. Missouri already requires all voters to show ID, and it works. We know, and there's been data and there's been documentation, including in a lawsuit that we just filed last year. A year ago right now, we were in trial with the nation's leading voter fraud expert witness who presented testimony of every single, even investigated case of fraud in Missouri. And of course, we know that there's never been a prosecuted instance of voter impersonation, the only irregularity that a photo ID requirement could vote. Instead, what legislation like strict photo ID requirements would do would be to eliminate forms of ID that Missouri voters rely upon, especially that voter notification card that you get from the election authority. It's required by law. It gets sent out to voters right before every election. It's a really terrific document because it reminds voters of the election day. It tells them when the polls are open. It tells them where their polling place is. It has their name and their address. It has a barcode on it, and voters in Missouri have come to rely on that documentation as a source of identification. It's particularly handy, especially since there were so many polling place changes amid the COVID pandemic. It reminded people where their polling places were. Such legislation would also eliminate a student ID issued by a college or university in the state of Missouri, something that many young voters and students rely upon to cast their ballot, as well as other reliable forms of identification like government-issued identification that has the voter's name and current address. The Secretary of State's outreach program has proven woefully insufficient. As you know, we filed a lawsuit and had a week-long trial 2 years ago in 2019 that laid bare the insufficiency of the outreach of the Secretary of State's program. Legislation that this committee passed last year in House Bill 334, as well as some of the other provisions, would have gone further by eliminating the statutory mandate for the Secretary of State to provide advance notice of ID requirements to voters, and eliminated the budget allocation for doing that. It's simply untenable to, limit voters' access any further, especially where we have a system that works, especially where we are already a voter ID state, where voters have come to rely on the forms of ID that they use at the polls, where there's never been any instance of voter impersonation to justify it. But then to go further and then starve a program that's designed to help people get IDs makes it even more farcical. So as we move forward, I would really encourage this committee to, as you're being thoughtful today and taking the time months before the start of the legislative session, take the time to think about what Missouri voters need. You may be aware that recently there was a report issued by the Campaign Legal Center in August of 2021 that ranked states by access to voting. And unsurprisingly, Missouri ranked near the bottom. And that's because there are many barriers to the ballot already in place. We should be thinking about in this committee, which is directed to protecting the interests of Missouri's voters and ensuring their ability to cast a ballot, could be thinking about ways to make access to the ballot more accessible for voters across the state of Missouri. Measures that are supported by Republicans and Democrats, like no excuse absentee voting, will go a long way to making ballot access more accessible, modernizing our voter registration processes, and more. I will stop there. My written testimony has been submitted, and we'll be back again when there's actual legislation on the table to provide an in-depth analysis of that legislation as well. But I'm happy to take any questions about any of this or about the lawsuits or the state of voter identification requirements in this country.
Thank you, lady. You mentioned that Missouri ranks near the bottom in voter access. What could we do to get to the top of the list? What are the top three things that make us such a poor state on access to the voters?
Thank you, Chairman Shaw. Unsurprisingly, I do have a list.
Shocking.
I think, at the top of the list, I think is a common sense reform that, again, both Republican and Democrat election officials support, and that is no excuse absentee voting. Missouri, 34 states plus the District of Columbia allow
So you
any
would have
voter to
supported
cast
738 where we had no excuse with photo ID? No, you wouldn't.
The reason in House Bill 738, there was a bifurcated process that only some absentee voters could cast a no-excuse absentee ballot. In fact, it was only those who had the flexibility to go to their local election authority office during working hours, had transportation to access that office. Only those folks were able to cast a no-excuse absentee ballot. But other people who needed absentee ballots, think seniors, people with chronic health conditions, shift workers, who have to request that ballot by mail, they would not have been eligible to get a no-excuse absentee ballot under that legislation. Okay. And none of those reasons I just stated would have allowed them to actually vote absentee in the state of Missouri under our extremely restrictive absentee voting laws.
So you weren't in support of at least opening up the no excuse with a photo ID?
I think we know that creating a two-tiered system, having first and second class of voters, is a recipe for confusion and disenfranchisement.
So we don't. So okay. What's another reason?
Well,
Let's keep going down the list. We got one, absentee voting. What would be another?
You know, another common sense reform that is also broadly supported by folks across the aisle includes voter registration modernization, automating the voter registration process when people interact with government agencies. We've already as you may have seen, the state of Missouri had to pay out a pretty hefty sum about a month ago, over $1 million in attorney's fees, after we had to sue the state of Missouri a few years back because it wasn't updating people's registrations at the Department of Motor Vehicles. A number of states, over 20 states, have some variation of automatic voter registration.
What's the number
that
three
allows
reason
that to
then?
happen.
What would be the number third thing? I'm just trying to get a grasp of why we're so poor, in your opinion. So what would be the third thing you would change?
Well, Missouri also doesn't have access to early voting. Now, if we had no excuse absentee voting that affected all voters, I think that would cover that process quite well.
And we had that with a photo ID, but you don't want the photo ID. So
it would not have applied to all voters. It would have only applied to a limited percentage of voters.
Okay. One other thing, you said that this process or this committee going about looking at photo ID was a folly. I think that was the word you used. What would you tell my constituents that voted 75% in favor of photo ID? Would you tell them that's a folly?
No, so
I cannot tell them it's a folly. I was voted by the people to come here to represent them, and I will continue to do that. So, is there any other questions for the lady? Representative Wyndham, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning.
Good morning, Representative Wyndham.
So I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you saying what you said about the process, right? Because it may not have happened in this committee, but in this body, being the Missouri House of Representatives, bills have gone through weird processes that aren't finger quote full. So one bill that comes to mind is the lifting of the tuition caps on higher education institutions. I was on the higher education committee. We heard the bill, didn't vote on the bill, and then it just popped up on the floor one day, and is now law, by the way. So I want to read to you Amendment 6 from 2016, and it kind of, in my mind, it shows how just one word can make a big difference. So the fair ballot language for Amendment 6, which was a photo voter ID, says, a yes vote will amend the Missouri Constitution to state that voters may be required by law to verify their identity, citizenship, and residence by presenting identification that may include valid government-issued photo identification. So if that was may as opposed to shall, does that change how you read Amendment 6?
Yes, but there's other operative language in there as well that says may include a photo ID. And since the priorities lawsuit, the Missouri Supreme Court looked at photo ID in Missouri after the passage of Amendment 6. What we know is that that amendment allows the legislature to require voters to identify themselves at the polls, including through a use of photo identification. That is what we do. Missouri does require all voters to present identification at the polls. Among the forms of identification voters may show includes a photo identification, but it can also be other forms of identification. And the Missouri Supreme Court found, even in the wake of Amendment 6, that eliminating those other forms of ID would pose constitutional problems under the Missouri Constitution. You know, the difference between Missouri and maybe those 7 other states that have a strict photo ID requirement, well, first, every state's law is slightly different, but Missouri's Constitution protects the right to vote at a higher level than the federal Constitution does. That's one reason why we can't sort of compare the Crawford case out of Indiana to the cases here in Missouri. This is something that came out of the post-Reconstruction era after the Civil War. It is something that I believe we should be eminently proud of. And Chairman Schall, I would suggest when you go and you talk to your constituents, we can tell them that we take pride in the fact that Missouri's Constitution enshrines the right to vote as a fundamental right, and that our laws are designed to protect both the rights of all voters to cast the ballot, as well as the integrity of the ballot process. And that's what Missouri's law currently does. And that's one reason why we don't have any problems. Secretary of State Ashcroft himself has repeatedly said that Missouri's elections are safe and secure.
All right.
Thank you
for
very
that.
much. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm not done, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind.
I thought you were. I'm sorry. Please proceed.
So, and I'll make this my last question. So, I wasn't going to bring up 738 because I don't really know. Are we talking about 738 or are we talking about 334? But it was addressed earlier, 738. So, do you think that, what do you think about the combination of only allowing in-person absentee or no excuse in-person absentee, while disallowing no excuse mail absentee, and saying that local election authorities can't cure ballots? So the combination of changing the law in one place, not changing it in another, and then also saying election authorities can just throw in the trash, if you will, not practically, but just throw away ballots that don't get that don't have a correct excuse, etc. on it.
Thank you for that question, Representative Windham. The issue of ballot curing is an important and relevant one, and I believe that some of the Secretary's calls come as a result of a lawsuit that we filed last year challenging the lack of opportunity for voters to get notice and cure of problems on absentee ballots. You know, it's something that we didn't really explore a lot because Missouri's absentee voting laws are so strict that historically Missourians have very low rates of casting absentee ballots. Obviously, the pandemic changed that, both in Missouri and around the country. And absentee balloting increased about fourfold, if not more, in the state of Missouri. And you began to see ballots getting rejected for minor errors like missing a checkbox or failing to double confirm that an address was correct. And many states do provide mandatory notice and cure where you are required to notify voters that, hey, you forgot to check this checkbox. It's for ministerial errors that end up resulting in rejection of ballots. We argued that failure to do so would violate the due process rights of Missouri voters because that right to vote is fundamental. But more broadly to your question, the other problem with House Bill 738 from last year was that it created two tiers of voters. First-class absentee voters who had the luxury of being able to travel to their local election authority during business hours to do so in person, and others who had to request ballots by mail. And the people that are relegated to having cast ballots by mail, think about who those are. Those are people who don't have the luxury of being able to travel to their local election authority. Those are going to be seniors, people with health conditions, shift workers, people that have jobs, people that are providing child care or elder care, people that have disabilities that may not qualify them otherwise to vote absentee. And these are the people who would be left out of legislation like House Bill 738. Our local election authorities know that no excuse absentee voting works. We saw great expansions in absentee voting in 2020. And it worked well for our state's clerks, and it works well for voters across the country. Like I said, the vast majority of states already allow this. The final thing about House Bill 738 that I'm going to say, because it relates to photo ID, and the other reason we opposed it was because it had a proviso that if the photo ID requirement was struck down in court, that the no excuse absentee voting mandate allowance would go away as well. That suggests a not very sincere effort to want to provide Missouri voters with no excuse absentee voting, particularly since this committee knows that a strict photo ID mandate is likely to be struck down in court.
Representative Behringer, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a quick question because I want to know if your group has done any efforts towards what I consider an issue that first happened with the presidential Obama and then happened during COVID. And basically in the state of Missouri, you have to have a Democrat and a Republican. So if I go into the hospital and I'm sick and I want to vote and it's past, being able to absentee. During COVID, the hospitals did not allow more than one person into that room. They couldn't because of COVID. So that happened back during Obama, and I can't remember what the illness was, but the hospitals had the same rule. one person in that hospital room at a time. Has your group come up with a way for us to figure out how to make sure that if I'm in the hospital and only one person's allowed to walk in that room, how I get to vote as a citizen?
Thank you, Representative Behringer. Certainly, the COVID pandemic presented numerous hurdles and barriers to the ballot, both for voter advocates like the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, as well as for our clerks. And I see several clerks who are here today who struggled to provide access to the ballot. What Missouri law says, and one of the issues here is that our deadline to request an absentee ballot is 2 weeks before Election Day. Some states have deadlines that are a little bit closer that would allow people who, within that 2-week period, who realize that maybe they shouldn't be going to the polls, to then go and get and request that absentee ballot. Here in Missouri, you can vote absentee until the day before Election Day, but only if you do so in person, and you're not going to be able to request that. So Missouri law does have a provision that says that if you become confined due to illness after that absentee ballot deadline, the local election authority is supposed to basically curbside vote you at the hospital, right? Elsewhere. Now, we had unique situations where, and it's a bipartisan team, right? So we did have some unique situations. I'm aware of clerks that, because people were quarantining at home, would actually go to people's homes to provide those ballots to them. And we even had circumstances on Election Day itself, and this always happens every Election Day. Our election protection hotline gets calls from people who, for whatever reason, find themselves in a hospital. Maybe they got into a car accident the night before. It is, the law does require those folks to get voted. We did have a situation, one situation, actually, I believe it was in Greene County, where it was a COVID ward and they were not able to get in and vote that voter. But we had other situations this November of folks who were in hospitals where the election authority was able to get the ballot to the voter. In some cases, they were able to do so through a proxy. So we had one situation where they were able, the bipartisan team was able to watch through plexiglass, because they have to be able to witness the voter sign. So that there were creative measures that were used. Under most circumstances, that sort of quarantining outside of something like COVID is highly unusual. And indeed, the act of finding oneself in the hospital on Election Day when you've neglected to request an absentee ballot in advance is something that's fairly rare, but it does happen every election, and Missouri law does make allowances for that. I applaud the local election authorities that found creative ways to effectuate that law by, being able to observe through a window and that sort of thing.
Further questions for the witness? Representative McGaugh, proceed.
Thank you. Do inquire. Welcome back. I appreciate you always being succinct and also presenting your testimony on paper so that we can read it in advance. But a couple of things that you just addressed are part of the bill in 738 that was authored by myself, working in conjunction with the local county clerks and election authorities of the 116 jurisdictions. And they want to be able to utilize this no excuse for a couple of reasons. One is they're already doing it. And if you all don't realize that, then you need to ask one of them, because they take upon face value when a person appears before them. And this is the reason why that part of the bill was for those persons that appear before them and not the persons out in the community that qualify for the other reasons to vote absentee. Those people you described, the sick, the infirm, those that aren't going to be at their local jurisdiction on Election Day because they work out of town. All of those instances you described are a reason to vote absentee, and they do. But the election authorities have, and they're Democrat and Republican, as we know, they've done studies, and this is part of their resolutions. Once again, they just met last week, and they have determined that the studies show that it cuts down on not voting, not the 90% that voted, this past election, but what it cuts down is confusion at the polls by the people who are not registered in the correct place. So as we drafted this language last year for 738, it was with those people in mind. It took I used in my 30 years as an election authority, it took those, what I call the problem children, out of the precinct on election day, got them before you. You could look them right in the eye. They could show their what they had to show you. That's allowable in law, and that is why we did not include the classes that weren't the healthy people that needed to come as a convenience. Those others you describe and there's plenty of ways. And those people that are the sick and the infirm, and I think I remember you telling us one other time, your mother was one of those, a person that could not get to the polls. Her ballot didn't need to be notarized. So if you were there at her home and helped her vote, the envelope, there's a place where you should sign that you helped her. If she's of sound mind and body, she can use her own signature. And again, that is compared with the voter registration on file. So if your mother ever, you described that she couldn't get an ID, but if she ever was well enough to come with you to her county clerk or election board's office, she would be allowed to vote there. So that was the premise behind that, because there are already plenty of excuses out there for those who truly need the excuse. And this no excuse with photo ID would allow those that just need to come in for the convenience because it's inconvenient on election day, but they still want to vote. I had one, I think you may have answered this. I noticed that on your witness appearance form, for the first time I've ever noticed, is that you checked the for informational purposes, but clearly, you are against photo ID, which is why we're here today. Is that right?
There's no legislation on the table, Representative, so I don't have anything to speak in support of or in opposition to.
I understand that you think that,
so no, I'm not. 35 states have voter identification requirements, including Missouri, and I'm perfectly fine with Missouri's Missouri is a voter ID state. So I'm not here in opposition to Missouri being a voter ID state. What I'm providing here is information about the nuances that go into assessment of what we call strict photo ID proposals. If I may respond to your inquiry, and I really want to first express appreciation, Representative McGraw, because your long-time experience as an election official it truly shows on this committee and significantly benefits this committee because you have that firsthand knowledge of how the process works, and I deeply appreciate that. But with all due respect, I will say that the categories of people who would have been excluded from no excuse absentee voting in House Bill 738 would not have been, that I listed, would not be eligible under Missouri's law. Missouri allows people to vote absentee only for a strict number of reasons, or 6 reasons. One of them is confined due to illness or disability. One is being outside the jurisdiction, right? Other is religious observance. People who have chronic health conditions, but who are not confined due to disability or illness, would not be able, technically, to check that box. People with disabilities who aren't confined at home would not be eligible to check that box, even if they would have great barriers to being able to appear in person at their local election authority office. Shift workers, low-wage workers who can't take off work, that's not a basis to vote absentee. You mentioned my mother. My mother is now 90, and I currently serve as her caretaker. And I had to make all kinds of arrangements. I had to cancel a medical appointment for today, all kinds of arrangements to be able to be here today because of that caretaking obligation. That's not a basis to vote absentee unless I'm serving as a caretaker for someone who is confined. And so now you might say, well, the clerks take people at face value for the reasons that they state, and we know that that people mark their absentee ballot forms when they want to vote absentee. But let's remember that you are signing that statement under penalty of perjury. And making a false statement on that absentee ballot affidavit, as much as we may laugh it off and people check that they're going to be outside the jurisdiction, making a false statement on that absentee ballot affidavit is an election offense. It constitutes election fraud that can cause the person to be prosecuted and lose their right to vote for the rest of their life. And so as someone that cares about the integrity of the process, I don't ever suggest that people do that. And I don't think that this committee should either, and pretend that our excuses are much broader than they are, that people can just ignore them. Instead, what we should do is follow the lead of the supermajority of states across this country that allow any voter to vote absentee without providing the government a reason. Most voters don't think that the government needs to know the reason that they cannot appear at the polls on election day. And we know that spreading out the process, absentee voting works. Local election authorities appreciate the ability to be able to process those ballots over time. This is a reform whose time has come, and we shouldn't be creating legislation that has multiple tiers and all sorts of conditions on it. Let's give Missouri voters no excuse absentee voting once and for all.
Well, that part is my bill, but I have to disagree with you to a point on the boxes and what you might check. If you're sick, you're sick. COVID showed that. You know, you might not have had symptoms for 2 months, but you didn't feel good. And that box says sick and or disabled, unless it's changed. And I'm sure somebody will tell us that. And it's going on all the time. So I appreciate your passion. I appreciate your concern. But what the time has come is that we make sure that the people who are presented before us to the election judges are, number one, registered, and they are who they say they are, and that can be accomplished with a more stricter ID, because you do not have to have a photo to register. And we're not even going to go there because we need to move on. So that's for another day, but thank you for being here.
Thank you, Representative.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Do you want me to leave a copy of this up here as well? Or?
We have it.
Okay.
Representative Schwandern, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To inquire.
Proceed.
Good morning. I have yet to had the pleasure of meeting you since we had the issue of COVID and you stayed away this session, but I am the freshman representative here on the committee, so it's good to finally see you in the flesh here. I just wanted to ask you, so in your opinion, based on the Missouri Constitution, would we then, any proposal to require a photo ID would then need to be a constitutional amendment?
So again, the devil is in the details, right? 35 states have some form of voter identification requirement, and they're all slightly different. And it all depends on what forms of ID you're eliminating, how you're providing those forms of ID, what sorts of barriers exist to getting them. But in short, what we would term, or what social scientists would term, a strict photo ID requirement is currently unconstitutional based on the Missouri Supreme Court's analysis. And yeah, that constitutional amendment would need to be amended further.
So amend it to say, to fit the bill of what I think some people are trying to get to here is a photo ID issued by the state of Missouri, by these, pretty much enshrining all of that into the Constitution.
In essence, eliminating that heightened protection that currently exists in Missouri's Constitution for the right to vote.
Okay, and you are with the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, correct?
That's correct.
And you've got 60 affiliated organizations. Who founded, or actually, let me ask first, is the Voter Protection Coalition a 501c3?
Yeah, it is a loosely knit it's going to be a 501c3 and a C4, but currently it's a loosely knit coalition. These are our civic organizations, nonpartisan organizations that began coming together in 2006 around the first iteration of photo ID requirements in Missouri, and then continued to keep meeting because the requirements kept meeting, and then we developed affirmative proposals, and we're working the polls, and here we are now, and it's a full-time gig. So there's a lot of work to be done to protect access to our elections. And listen, Missouri is what we're doing right now is part of a nationwide reckoning. As we know, states around the country are battling with questions about who has a right to access the ballot and on what terms. Our federal government, Senate, returned to Washington, D.C. last night with 2 voting bills on the table, the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We are really in the middle. What is happening right here today is a microcosm of conversations that are happening around the country right now. And that's because we are at a crossroads on questions about who gets to participate and on what terms. And so for that reason, I do appreciate that, Chairman Shaw, that you've created the space to have a conversation of this nature, because it is an important one, and it is an important one of reflection. But I do hope and believe that history will shine well on us on these questions and show that we decided as Missouri to protect our fundamental constitutional right to vote and move forward to ensure that voters have more access, not less.
So where does your organization get their funding?
We're grant funded.
Grant funded, okay. And are you familiar, probably are, with the Commission on Federal Election Reform?
Yes.
That was chaired by President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker.
Yes, the Carter-Baker Commission.
And their recommendations on photo ID for voting?
Well, there's some interesting backstories on that. What they recommended was voter identification for voting, and the ensuing legislation that passed out of that commission, which was called the Help America Vote Act of 2002, does mandate that first-time voters who register by mail present identification, but it allows a range of forms of identification, not what we're calling the strict state-issued photo ID. In fact, the forms of ID that are allowed by HAVA mirror the forms of ID that voters can currently present in the state of Missouri. What I would suggest to you, and actually what is the truth, is that Missouri goes even farther than the Help America Vote Act, which requires only first-time voters to show that form of ID. Missouri requires all voters to show ID every time they go to the polls, and the list includes that list that is contained in the Help America Vote Act of 2002.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Help America Vote Act of 2002, and then House Bill 511 from Representative Bill Deacon in 2003, since I worked on that when I was a student lobbyist for the Associated Students of the University of Missouri. However, the Commission on Federal Election Reform and the report of Building Confidence in U.S. Elections came out in September of 2005, and it was their direct recommendation that we do implement IDs with photos. Now, it did go a step further, actually, and required the real IDs as well. And I know that was a trip up with some of the other commissioners on that committee, that, you know, having that extra step of real ID would cause states to have, you know, 2 separate ID issues. However, in Missouri, I don't believe that we do have that issue, since we do still implement real IDs and non-real IDs. So any comments on that one?
I mean, you know, we're talking about legislation that is 20 years old and a report that was 16 years old. And what we certainly know is that states didn't begin implementing photo ID requirements until after that time period. Missouri is actually one of the first, along with Georgia and Indiana, to attempt to implement a strict photo ID requirement. And that's when the courts started analyzing the nature of the ways that mandates that require people to have to get a DMV-issued ID can disenfranchise voters. And in the ensuing 16 years, there have been a slew of studies, a slew of court cases, a slew of analyses that really laid bare the actual lived experiences of people who faced issues with underlying documents that maybe folks didn't think about, who faced errors or omissions on those underlying documents, name changes. You know, we hear one of our clients in the last photo ID case runs the ID acquisition program at a church in St. Louis, deals with a lot of unhoused people who they may be ineligible to get a state ID because they may have one on file, but they've lost it, something that's very common for that population, or they've lost those underlying documents. Back, we dealt with people, we're dealing with lots of natural disasters these days after the Joplin tornadoes, which now is a long time ago here in Missouri. You may recall there was a hospital that was blown away. All those records were lost. Lots of those underlying documents, there's a variety of reasons that people don't have them. And over the ensuing 16 years since that report was drafted, those people's experiences have become clear, have been brought out to the courts. And what we know here in Missouri is that the Missouri Supreme Court has found those barriers to create an undue burden on Missourians' right to vote.
Based on our Constitution.
We are in Missouri, and
Yeah.
this is based on the Missouri
Okay.
Constitution.
So, yeah, that gets back to my original question, but I'll close here just real quick. I know one of the things that we always focus on is ensuring that our elections are trustworthy. I know Chairman Shaw always mentions it at the beginning of every hearing, of every meeting, and I just want to point out back in August last year, an NBC SurveyMonkey poll polled that 55% of this nation was not too confident or not at all confident in our elections. And so the people here in Missouri, when they implemented Amendment 6, they probably felt that it was going to be, when it says voter ID, people immediately think driver's license. So they probably felt that that is what they were getting to help ensure trustworthiness in the elections. It was 44,601 people. It had 65% of the Republicans said they weren't too confident. 46% of Democrats felt that it was not too confident. And 56% of independents felt that it was not too confident. So I'm here. I want to make sure that everyone is confident in their elections. And I believe it is the majority of Americans that, in order to restore a little confidence and faith in our elections process, are wanting to see a photo ID in Missouri.
I share your goal of instilling confidence in American elections. And like I mentioned, we are at a crossroads, both here in Missouri and across the country. And the fear and the narratives and the misinformation about voting that have taken place, that have elevated over recent years, have contributed to the consternation that some people feel about voting in elections. But what we also know is that the majority of Americans, for them to feel confident in elections, they want to know that every eligible voter is able to cast a ballot. And that is the goal.
Thank you, Ms.
that we
Lieberman,
share.
for your comments today. I would add to the end that everyone's vote should count the same as one and should be trusted. No other questions for the witness. Thank you very much. We are short on time. We will, who's ever next, please, if we can keep from repeating, it would be great, but certainly want to hear what do you have to say, gentlemen.
Good morning. My name is Robert Oakes. I'm from Gladstone, Missouri. I drove up today, so I appreciate you allowing me to have this time before this honorable election House Committee. And it's probably a good time for me to go because I want to give you a practical example of photo ID. When I go to vote, and I put down my card, my voter registration card that they send me, and the ladies at the desk, they always say, "Don't you have a driver's license?" They said, "We want to see your driver's license." And so I give them my driver's license. And that speeds things up. There's been times when people start pulling out paper in front of me, and we stand there for 5 minutes as they're fishing through this paper, figuring out if this person can vote or not to vote. And so I'm saying a voter ID, simply in a practical, common sense thing, speeds the process up. You know, the people behind me that are waiting to vote, they don't want to be waiting 5 or 6 minutes while they go through all this paperwork shuffle to see if they have the right identification. and just as a practical sense. So, and that's what I'd like to say. And right now, I'm going through this Real ID, and you know what you have to go through to get this. I mean, I'm still pulling up documents and so forth. You know, 1 of 9 and 2 of 13, and oh my goodness, you know, I still don't have them all together yet, and my driver's license runs out the 29th of this month. So anyway, that's what I'd like to say, and speeding up, and I really wish you would have given everyone, you know, 5 or 10 minutes to speak, maximum, instead of having somebody filibust and take all your time. So that's what I have to say today, and God bless America, and let's fix this election.
Thank you, sir. And if I'm sure your representative will help you on any of the documents you need while you're in town here, just make sure you go upstairs and see that person, and I'm sure they'll help you today.
I already have.
All right, fantastic. Hopefully they're helping you. If not, Secretary of State's person's right there, and I'm sure we can get somebody from Department of Revenue to help you as well. Make your trip here great. Is there any questions for the witness? Remember, we are short on time. Before you go, Representative, how many other people are there to testify? We have 2, 3, 4. All right.
Yeah, I could have said a lot more, but I want to. I want to be.
I think you could have.
I want to be respectful.
I appreciate it. Representative Wyndham, quickly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Thank you for taking that long drive to be here. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the practicality in what you said. So you said that folk. So I guess maybe first I should get your barometer of what your main reason that you want photo ID is. So your main thing is you want to speed up the process. Is that what the practicality in what you're saying is?
Exactly.
All right. You just one principal photo ID proponent is that you want to speed up the process.
I'm just giving you a practical application of what I see, you know, and the people behind me, and especially, you know, the last couple of elections, you know, there's 200 people behind me.
Okay.
You know, and if it takes 5 or 6 minutes for every person to go through, you're there hours.
Sure. So first of all, I think it's problematic that I think it's the supervisor asks you for a different form of ID when you give them a form of ID. That's highly problematic, because let's say I get frustrated and I just leave since I can't use my form of ID that I have right now to vote, which is legal, by the way. I think that's very problematic that they did that. Also, in my mind, a thing that'll speed up the process is if we had all mail elections, then we won't have to have anybody stand in line. So if we just want to,
that's another issue. We're not talking about mail-in ballots today. We're talking about voter ID.
Sure, we're not talking about mail-in ballots, which we could be because we don't know what bill is in front of us. But hold on, sir.
That's why we're getting all this extra time, because you're talking about, you know, 15 other things.
But the thing about this time is both of our time. It's your time as a constituent of the state of Missouri, and it's my time as a representative, because I represent a lot of people in my mind. So I'm going to ask you again, if practicality is the thing that you brought up to why we should have photo vote ID and that it should move faster, then I'll tell you that what moves even faster is if everybody mails in their ballot. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You know, some things, everybody's got a nose, so everybody has an opinion, you know, and I appreciate that the left and the right and the Dems and the Republicans have honest debate. This country needs to have honest debate. This thing of being afraid to debate has got to stop.
I appreciate your comments today, sir, and thank you very much. Hopefully your trip will be worthwhile to get those paperworks done. Thank you very much. Next person that would like to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Shane Scholler, County Clerk of Greene County, testifying on my personal behalf as well as County Clerk of Greene County, where almost 67% of the voters voted in favor of a photo ID provision back in 2016. I think as we talk about the person that we're concerned about who doesn't have a photo ID, which I think the provisional portion of the legislation that we have now that's enacted in statute takes care of that person as a county election authority. Think about the person who's had their vote taken away from them. We seem to forget about that person. We know when some individuals think they can tip the scales of an outcome, they will go to nefarious means to do so. We know in our state, unfortunately, in 2010, we had an election where the will of the people was subverted due to election fraud. So we have to take this matter seriously. And I believe if there's any sacred privilege we have as American citizens, it is that privilege to be able to vote. And I want to protect just as much the person's right to vote as that ballot. Because it is extremely important that we not forget that the will of the people be respected on the day of the election. And we do everything we can. And here's the situation. It's much easier to make a counterfeit paper document than it is a photo ID, period. If they don't have that photo ID, let them fill out that provisional ballot envelope. We can then go back and compare it with the signature that we have on file to make sure that person's vote gets counted. I think we need to keep those things in mind, and I won't go any further with my testimony, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Next person. Proceed when ready.
Yes, sir. Chairman Schall, members of the committee, Lieutenant Colonel retired David Stevens. We met last month. I'm just going to hit the highlights because I think you have a hard copy of my testimony. I'm here to update some of what I said, to answer some of your questions, but the biggest reason I'm here is to offer a solution. So the second page has a proposed solution. I'm not going to go through that because of our limited time, but I would like to hit just a couple of highlights. I wanted to thank Representative Windham last month for pointing us to the Department of Homeland Security. I went to the Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and it's their responsibility to protect U.S. elections as critical infrastructure as defined by the U.S. government. In June of last year, they issued a security tip to all state and local governments saying voter registration databases are rich targets and may be an attractive target for computer intrusions. This problem is not unique to individual states. It is shared across the nation. And then that same report provided preventive measures and best practices. However, it said those, if you do everything, you could prevent as much as 85% of your vulnerabilities. What that means is if we 100% did all those recommendations in Missouri, there's still 15% vulnerability to cyber attack. On the 28th of October of 2020, 6 days before the general election, both CISA and FBI issued a statement saying that there had been enough cyber attacks already against our election infrastructure throughout the country to trigger Executive Order 13848, which requires the Director of National Intelligence to produce a report within 45 days of the election. It didn't happen within 45 days, but that trigger says that that threshold was met for the number of cyber attacks we'd seen. Our electronic election systems are vulnerable, and they were subject to foreign cyber attacks. To address, I think, a couple of your concerns, Representative McGaugh, it's actually a myth that our machines are not connected to the internet, that they're invulnerable to attack. And I appreciated Chairman Schall bringing up the situation with Target, where all of their customer information was compromised through a cyber attack going through the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning unit. It wasn't even a direct attack through electronic systems. Another thing, our machines do not have any modems, is what you had verified, and I appreciate that. The problem is, if we cannot open the machines, we do not know what's in the machines. Because of supply chain vulnerabilities, whether it's where the chips are made, and 75% of the chips are made in Asia, or during the manufacturing process, or even the software that is put on those machines, we don't know what backdoors are in there or what vulnerabilities there are, or whether or not they may have a modem capability on a chip or another part of that machine. So I don't want us to have a false sense of security. I want to go to Seth Keshel's analysis because it only uses public data from previous presidential elections. He looked at every county in Missouri, and he found statistical evidence of either strong or rampant fraud in only 2 counties in Missouri, Clay and St. Charles. There were another 12 counties that are listed there where there was suspect or likely fraud just based on a statistical analysis. What I'd like to recommend is that you start forensic audits in 4 counties: Clay, St. Charles, Jefferson, and Greene. I'd like to conclude with foreign and malign powers control our elections and determine the outcome at the national level. We as a country are at war, but we don't know it. So I'd take any questions based on our limited time.
I thank you for your testimony printed out for us. We'll review it, and I'm sure if any of the members of the committee have anything, they'll get with you, and I appreciate meeting with you this morning. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I believe we have another gentleman on the right side wanted to testify.
I was just notifying you that there were 4 people back here that wanted to.
Okay. Who else wanted to?
Good morning, Verily. Good morning. My name is Mo Delvilar. I am the Legislative Associate for the ACLU of Missouri. I am here today in this informational hearing to relay our concerns over these more strict photo ID proposals that were introduced in the last session. Proposals that would require voters who lack an ID to cast provisional ballots that would not count unless they return with an ID. We know that these strict voter IDs are unconstitutional and burden more than 200,000 valid Missourians who do not have current state-issued photo IDs. These requirements that have been introduced in the past disproportionately impact communities of color and the elderly, as well as those who may be transient. There's a catch-22 with those who need government IDs. If you can't get housing, because you can't get an ID without housing, you can't get housing without an ID. So those people who also have the right to vote are unable to exercise their right with this form of strict voter ID. As was mentioned previously already, the Missouri Supreme Court has decided, again, as recently as last year, that these types of strict voter IDs are unconstitutional. They have repeatedly stated that strict photo ID requirements for voters imposes a heavy and substantial burden on Missourians' free exercise of the right to suffrage, which is in violation of Missouri's Constitution. I suppose that we all have a redistricting hearing here in about 10 minutes, so I welcome any questions that I can answer at this time.
Representative Tolson Rush, proceed.
I have more of a comment than a question, but you're the second witness to throw out this 200,000 amount of people that do not have photo ID. I just want to clarify that came from a former Missouri Secretary of State when they tried to match up the voter rolls to people with no driver's license or non-driver ID. But what they could not match or tell as of this alleged 200,000 number, how many of those 200,000 were dead? How many of those were in prison? How many of those had an expired license, were revoked or suspended? And how many moved out of state and did not renew their Missouri license? No one knows that answer. So I think it's very misleading to use a number of 200,000 alleged, disenfranchised alleged people. So I'm still waiting for someone to bring me a person without a photo ID that's a registered voter and wants one, because as was said before, they can get one for free. So that 200,000 number is how many, you cannot know how many thousands of dead people I've gotten removed from rolls. And I'm sure the dead people did not have a valid driver's license. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If I could just comment on that very briefly. This committee has committed itself to honoring the way that the voters have felt about the election. I have heard numerous times that, if just one person is unsure about our elections, we need to go through all the election security hearings that we've been doing for the past month, and I'm sure will come in the coming months and sessions. Even if you were to remove all the dead people, all of the people that you discussed who may be homeless or not have IDs or not have underlying documents for any reason, there is still a significant amount of people who are unable or do not have at this time a government-issued ID. And like Representative Wyndham said before, if the previous gentleman had came up with a non-photo ID that was acceptable by law, he should not have been asked to bring his driver's license, and that may have deterred him from voting that day for thinking that he needed to bring that form of a photo ID instead. So this still affects a wide swath of people, even if you were to remove whatever number it is that you would need to remove to verify that out of that 200,000.
We got
Any
2 minutes.
questions?
Can you do it in 2 minutes? You're on the clock, sir. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just briefly ask you, it's been asked many a times, and it may have even been presented once out of the many times it's been asked for, if we can have that analysis that the Secretary of State, even though it was a former Secretary of State, still the elected Secretary of State for the state of Missouri at that time, what that exact analysis is. Because from an article I'm reading, it separates out expired IDs and voters with forfeited driver's licenses. So there is some distinction in the categories. I'm just wondering if you have direct access to that document.
I'm not sure, but as the Secretary of State's office is here and could help the previous gentleman with his ID, I'm sure they would be happy to provide some of those additional breakdowns that they provide to all of us for this information.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. That concludes our hearing today. Make sure you fill out a witness form. I'm sure you've done that. That concludes our hearing on election and elected officials. Thank you very much.